I will pass on our collective disapproval for that decision. It's
Somebody has told us to have it a bit quicker.
what can you do? What can you do? So instead, so I will be delivering the talk on David's behalf, which means, because this is outside of my research area, I'm going to be talking with even less authority than I usually do. And if any of you knows David, he's principally to students, David is at least a foot higher than I am, with lots and lots of ginger hair, so I'm not going to do an impersonation. I will read what he says, and I'll read his lecture. But just as I say, concerns African Americans and the Great War. For African Americans, I suppose I was going to do an introduction, but I didn't wait to introduce myself as somebody else. David works on civil rights and race relations in American context, focusing really on Civil War era, but moving on to the 20th century as well. So for African Americans, the Great War was something of an irony. A crusade to free the victims of German autocracy at a time when millions of black Americans were themselves in dire need of liberation. Even before the United States entered the conflict, the war had begun to change black lives in ways that still resonate today. At the start of the war, most African Americans were Southerners. They walked the same roads and worked the same crops as their enslaved parents and grandparents. During the war, however, things began to change. The First World War was the catalyst for the Great Migration, the mass migration of African Americans from the southern states to those of the north. Something that was alluded to by Chris this morning. Before the war, prospects for black Americans were dim in the northern states. They were discriminated against by employers, and they were banned from trade unions. Thus, from a black population of around 10 million, only about 200,000 had made the journey north by the time that war erupted in the Old World. In 1910, around 90% of blacks still lived in the South in 1910. Roughly the same proportion as at the outbreak of the Civil War 50 years earlier. From 1914 to 1918, however, around 330,000 black Americans migrated north, although it's worth bearing in mind this is still relatively tiny compared to levels of migration during the 1940s and 50s. The black population of New York almost doubled, while the black population of Chicago more than doubled. What lay behind this great migration? Well, the most important pull factor was a labour shortage in the north. The war cut off the supply of European immigrants, who since the middle of the 19th century had been arriving at the docks of America's east coast in their millions, fleeing persecution, autocracy on the continent, as well, of course, famine in Ireland. At the same time, American industries raced to fill Allied war orders. This economic boom time stood in stark contrast to the devastation racking continental Europe. In the end, although they were initially hostile to black workers, profit trumped prejudice, and northern factories began to send recruiters to the agricultural south. And here we can see, again compounding what Chris was saying this morning, we can see here that the jobs are also being opened up to, with jobs being opened up to both men and women. There was a political as well as economic dimension to the Great Migration. As one investigator at the Department of Labour argued, the treatment accorded to the Negro always stood second, when not first, among the reasons given by Negroes for leaving the South. After the Civil War ended in 1865, black Southerners had enjoyed a decade during which they were able to exercise an unprecedented degree of freedom and power during Reconstruction. Blacks could vote and ride on streetcars with whites, they sat on juries, in halls of legislation, and even, in the case of Louisiana, the state governor's chair. However, since the end of Reconstruction in 1877, African Americans had seen their rights systematically stripped back. They lost the vote, fell victim to lynching, and witnessed the birth of a system of segregation named Jim Crow, after a character from Blackface minstrelsy. The years between 1889 and 1915 were described by the historian Rayford Logan as the nadir of black life in America. As African Americans faced a storm of violence, peaking in 1893, with the lynching of a black American on average every 2 days. Again and again, this lynching was justified with reference to what was known as the one true crime, the rape of a white woman. At the turn of the century, the black, quote, beast rapist was the most powerful myth in the South. Unsurprisingly, many black Southerners were pretty keen to get out. As one job seeker put it, I myself is anxious to leave this part of the country and be where a Negro man can appreciate being a man. Or, as another declared, I am in the darkness of the South. Oh, please help me to get out of this low-down country where I am treated no more than a dog. The war also made a huge impact upon black politics. Many leaders hoped to use the war as leverage to improve African American life. Black sacrifice in French fields, it was hoped, would be rewarded at home by the amelioration of Jim Crow. African Americans appropriated the idealistic rhetoric of the war to press for change. After all, if they were going to risk their lives for the country, then surely they deserved some rights. As the pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, Adam Powell, reasoned, quote, while we love our flag and our country, we do not believe in fighting for the protection of commerce on the high seas until the powers that be give us at least some verbal assurance that property and lives of the members of our race are going to be protected on land from Maine to Mississippi. Let us have the courage to say to the white American people, give us the same rights which you enjoy, and then we will fight by your side with all of our might for every international right on land and sea. Younger and more radical African Americans were sceptical that wartime efforts would be rewarded. After all, Crispus Attucks, a person of colour, was the first American killed during the Revolution, and his fellow African Americans were rewarded with a century of slavery. 200,000 black Americans had fought for the Union during the Civil War to be rewarded with segregation and lynching, the chain gang and the county farm. Perhaps a little radical cynicism was not out of place. However, as most blacks realised, disloyalty would be suicide. So we have a quote here from the poet James Weldon Johnson. The bold truth is that the Negro cannot afford to be treated as a disloyal element in the nation. Imagine the results if he should arouse against him the sentiment which is now directed against the pro-German element. Still, in July 1917, thousands of African Americans marched down Fifth Avenue in protest against Jim Crow, their placards bearing slogans such as "Make America Safe for Democracy," "Taxation without representation is tyranny," and "Mother, do lynchers go to heaven?" The truth was that the government needed African Americans, it needed black workers at home, and it needed black troops abroad. Thus, the Democratic administration attempted to counter black radicalism. They appointed conservative black leaders to a host of token positions, while disseminating propaganda to black audiences. Some work by a historian by the name of Ronald Schaefer, who's noted that the government used exactly the same techniques that it had honed to deal with the white working classes. The War Department tasked Emmett Scott with stirring black enthusiasm for the war effort. The war, Scott explained, was a people's war, not a white man's war, not a black man's war, but a war of all people under the stars and stripes for the preservation of human liberty throughout the world. So therefore, obviously, a very clear link to what we've been talking about this morning. If Germany won, Scott warned the consequence would be re-enslavement for African Americans. Nevertheless, as Scott himself was well aware, many African Americans remained sceptical of the war effort, and rumours circulated in black communities that African American troops, as they would be 50 years later in Vietnam, were being sent into the most dangerous areas in order to spare white lives. Meanwhile, radical African Americans were placed under surveillance, lent on to moderate their opinions. If that didn't work, they were in jail. The National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, the NAACP, took note, warning the editors of its official magazine, The Crisis, to avoid making a similar mistake. The editor of The Crisis, the well-known African-American campaigner W.E.B. Du Bois, perhaps only coincidentally, produced a series of hawkish articles declaring in his famous Closed Ranks editorial that a demonstration of patriotism would aid the cause of racial progress. "Let us, while this war lasts," he wrote, "forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our fellow citizens and the allied nations that we are fighting for democracy. We make no ordinary sacrifice, but we make it gladly and willingly, with our eyes lifted to the hills." In response to such encouragement, millions of African Americans lent their support to the war, purchasing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of war bonds. The vast majority of black newspapers backed the war, and even radicals, such as William Monroe Trotter of the National Equal Rights League, supported it. However, hopes that blacks would soon be rewarded for their service with steps towards racial equality were dashed. Although around 350,000 African Americans served during the First World War, the Army and Navy confined their black servicemen to menial non-combat roles, while the Army initially turned down black volunteers. Southerners were especially opposed to black enlistment because the system of Southern apartheid was predicated upon the denial of black manhood. Those who managed to enter the Army were faced with segregation as rigid as anything in the Jim Crow South. 90% of black troops were sent to the services of supply to work as labourers. In response to complaints, the Secretary of War pointed out that there was, quote, "far less hazard to the life of the soldier connected with service battalion than on the firing line." Educated African Americans who managed to join up were denied commission. To many white soldiers, saluting a black man was unthinkable. A case in point was Colonel Charles Young of the 10th Cavalry. At the start of the war, he was the highest ranking of the 1,000 African Americans already serving in the Army, and had distinguished himself in 1916 by leading a cavalry charge against Pancho Villa's guerrillas during the Mexican Revolution. After a raft of complaints from his subordinate white officers, several of whom penned letters to their senators, Young was discharged, supposedly on the grounds of ill health. Although to prove that he was hale and hearty, he rode on horseback from his home in Ohio all the way to the White House. Pretty ballsy thing, that. Under pressure from the civil rights organisation, the NAACP, the War Department established a special training camp for black officers in Fort Des Moines, Iowa. In the end, 1,100 blacks served as officers, although an episode at one camp was typical of their treatment. When black officers arrived at the camp, nearly 90% of white troops refused to salute them. As one soldier at another training camp reflected, all of us were from Texas, and we were not about to get used to saluting N-word officers. None but a handful of black soldiers ever rose above the rank of captain. In the face of racism and extremely poor living conditions in their segregated training camps, black soldiers responded in different ways. Some ignored the problems, enjoyed their time in the army in spite of all of this. Some complained through military channels about their treatment. Others adopted an apathetic, cynical persona, as a popular army song at the time, which put it, joined the army to get free clothes. What we're fighting about, nobody knows. The American Expeditionary Force shipped American racism across the Atlantic. The attitudes of the French were of particular concern to politicians and to army commanders. The French were believed notoriously colourblind, and white Americans feared that if the Frenchmen, or worse, French women, treated black soldiers as equals, they would be impossible to contain when they returned home to the States. Indeed, the relative absence of rigid racial distinctions in the French colony of Louisiana had been one of the main problems facing the Americans when Thomas Jefferson bought it from a cash-strapped Napoleon in 1803. In France, although the Expeditionary Force had no official policy on race, its members took steps to prevent interracial association. Whites-only signs proliferated on US Army buildings, black troops made to it separately. As Charles Houston, Dean of the Howard University Law School, who served as a lieutenant in the African-American 92nd Division, recalled, "The hate and scorn heaped upon us as Negro officers by Americans in France convinced me that there was no sense of dying in a world ruled by them. They made us eat on benches in order to maintain segregation, and they destroyed our prestige in front of French officers." In August 1917, a French liaison to the Expeditionary Force was handed a secret memo to circulate amongst French civil and military leaders. This memo was entitled "Secret Information Concerning Black Troops," and it read, "It is important for French officers who have been called upon to exercise command over black troops, or to live in close contact with them, to have an exact idea of the position occupied by Negroes in the United States. Although a citizen of the United States, the black man is regarded by the white American as an inferior being with whom relations of business or service only are possible. The vices of the Negro are a constant menace to the American, who has to repress them sternly. For instance, the black American troops in France have by themselves given rise to as many complaints for attempted rape as all the rest of the army. And the black American soldiers sent to France have been the choicest with respect to physique and morals, for the number disqualified at the time of mobilisation was enormous." That's a bundle of chuckles, isn't it? Of especial concern to the Expeditionary Force was that the French, quote, "make a point of keeping the native cantonment from spoiling the Negroes. Americans become greatly incensed at any public expression of intimacy between white women with black men." According to the memo, familiarity on the part of white women with black men was an overweening menace to the prestige of the white race. However, as the historian Richard Slotkin noted in his recent book, Lost Battalions, Leonard's memo may not have been entirely effective. French generals continued to praise black units who served effectively. By the end of the war, 171 African-American soldiers had been awarded the French Legion of Honor. Some black troops suspected white Americans wanted them to fail. The 92nd Division was sent into combat gravely underprepared. A quarter of its men had almost no training. Many had been training only for a week, some only for a couple of hours. The division became a dumping ground for third-rate white officers, almost all of whom expected their black troops to perform badly as a result of ingrained racial defects. Only one unit of the 92nd saw battle in the Argonne Offensive, the 368th Infantry Regiment. After a disastrous first showing, the entire division was removed from the offensive, and the general of the 92nd suspected that white expeditionary forces officers wanted to get black troops out of the Argonne, quote, while their credit was bad. After the war, this episode was raised repeatedly by white officers in order to discredit the war record of African Americans, despite the fact that a third of American units had disintegrated during the Argonne Offensive. As Ronald Schaefer has argued, the record of black troops in the First World War was not just distorted, it was erased. Without mention in school history books and public discussion, black soldiers were lost from national memory. Okay, so we'll turn now then from the battlefront to domestic American life and looking at the domestic impact of the war. What was happening on the home front while blacks were hazarding their life across the Atlantic? At home, deciding where to train black troops proved problematic. Since the Civil War, white supremacists in the South had equated the presence of black soldiers in their states with the threat of violence. After emancipation in 1865, the presence of black Union troops in the South came to symbolise a world turned upside down. In August 1917, Mississippi Senator James K. Vardaman gave voice to these fears. It is a lamentable fact, and one we should be prepared to meet, that one of the horrible problems which will grow out of this unfortunate war, which the southern white people particularly must meet and overcome, is the training as a soldier which the Negro will receive. Impress the Negro with the fact that he is defending the flag, inflate his untutored soul with military airs, teach him that it is his duty to keep the emblem of the nation flying triumphantly in the air. It is but a short step to the conclusion that his political rights must be respected, even though it is necessary for him to give his life in defence of those rights, and you at once create a problem far-reaching and momentous in character. Black mobilisation, it would seem, was anathema to the South. We should, however, be aware of generalisation. Historian Chad Williams has argued in a recent book called The Torchbearers of Democracy. Many southern business leaders, like their northern counterparts, put profit ahead of prejudice, championed black recruitment as a spur to the war effort which they hoped would stimulate southern industrial development. Having always been one of the most vociferous champions of southern industrialisation, the Atlanta Constitution declared, "The Negro has no divided allegiance. He is plainly and entirely an American, but with no blood qualms to influence his fighting against any race or nationality engaged as America's foe. He is loyal to government, obedient to discipline, and according to military men, when he gets into the fight, full of courage." To my ears, stepping aside out David Cox's shoes for a second, it sounds to me very, very much like what's the case in the British Empire, I believe in martial races, that there are some races that are ethnic groups that are felt to be predisposed towards military ability, but they're also, you know, if you show them discipline, that they will follow you to the end. You know. In 1917, mass migration, militancy, and military service resulted in a ferocious white backlash. Illinois' East St. Louis, summer riots broke out. The city's black population had doubled during the war and had become targets of white working class resentment after they were used as strike breakers by the Aluminium Ore Company. With no opposition from the incompetent mayor, no opposition from corrupt police forces, mobs including white women and children set alight black homes, shot fleeing residents, and strung up black men on telegraph poles. After the dust settled, 40 blacks and 8 whites had lost their lives. In the same year, fuming over the beating of a black woman by a white policeman, black soldiers of the 24th Infantry Regiment, stationed at Cap Logan, attacked the police station in Houston, leaving 19 whites and 2 blacks dead. As a result, 29 soldiers received the death sentence. 19 black soldiers swiftly hanged. The sentences of the remaining perpetrators were commuted by President Wilson after the NAACP appealed for clemency. Violent outbreaks like those in East St. Louis and Houston shaped the response of African Americans to the war, and their demands for racial justice became increasingly militant as the war progressed. After the war, black leaders who had cooperated with the Wilson administration could not help but feel embittered by the failure of the war to open doors of opportunity. W.E.B. Du Bois, the editor of The Crisis, who had appealed to African Americans to close ranks, announced in 1919, "We return fighting. We stand again to look America squarely in the face and call a spade," he wrote in characteristically lyrical prose. "We sing, this country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. It lynches, it disfranchises its own citizens, it steals from us, it insults us. We return from fighting, we return fighting." Oh, that's quite a phrase, isn't it? We return from fighting, we return fighting. "Having fought for democracy in Europe," continued Du Bois, "we are cowards and jackasses if we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land." In New York City, the intellectual hub of the black world, changes were afoot. In 1917, as a working-class militancy was on the rise against the nation, the black communist A. Philip Randolph printed the first copy of The Messenger, a radical Marxist newspaper which ridiculed Du Bois for his early support of the war, criticising also the black church and black leaders for ignoring class politics. At the same time, a 30-year-old Jamaican immigrant by the name of Marcus Garvey arrived in the city, mixing a focus on self-improvement with the radicalism of black northerners like Randolph. Garvey's black nationalism attracted a huge following. Woodrow Wilson's principle of national self-determination, it was hoped, might be extended to nations of Africa. Africa, declared Garvey, must be for the Africans. The war also stimulated the expansion of the NAACP in the South, marking the end of an era in which black Southerners accommodated themselves to Jim Crow. In 1914, there were only 3 branches of the NAACP in the South. By 1919, there were 131. It was from 3 to 131, out of a total of 310 across the whole nation. But what of those African Americans returning from war? Black veterans disturbed white supremacists. Not only were they trained to fight, trained to defend themselves, not only were they more self-assertive, but they also laid claim to the quasi-religious reverence the United States accords its veterans. For these reasons, 1919 was marred by an epidemic of racial violence, otherwise known as the Red Summer. As one newspaper complained, echoing 1917's secret memo concerning black troops, Negro soldiers returning from the war inflamed their people with stories of race equality in Europe, especially the lack of discrimination in social intercourse. The old threadbare lie was wheeled out once more. Black men were dangerous super predators, hell-bent on the defilement of white women. According to the Tuskegee Institute, while there had been 36 lynchings over the course of 1917, 76 black Americans fell victim to the lynch mob in 1990. Wilson did very little to stem the violence, eventually issuing a condemnation of mob brutality. Indeed, the Southern-born president held black people in low regard, something very briefly touched upon by John in his talk. In the 1880s, he had voiced the view that they were an inferior race, incapable of the proper exercise of suffrage. Although his views were moderated later in life, by the First World War he had come to believe that racial equality might be achieved in 200 to 300 years. Violence against black workers was playing a long game, isn't it really? Violence against black workers was found legitimisation in the Red Scare of the same year, which was fostered by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and overlapped with related efforts to stamp out trade union militancy. In this climate, black militants could easily be labelled communists, which in the case of A. Philip Randolph and the staff of the Messenger, they absolutely were. Last year, the Equal Justice Initiative of Montgomery, Alabama, released a new report, a 53-page addendum to an early report, Lynching in America, a survey of racial terror between 1877 and 1950. Lynching in America tallied 4,075 lynchings, 800 more than any previous count. The new report is entitled Lynching in America, Targeting Black Veterans, and concludes that, quote, no one was more at risk of experiencing violence and racial terror than black veterans. As the director of the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson, told the New Yorker magazine last year, we do so much in this country to celebrate and honour folks who risk their lives on the battlefield, but we don't remember the black veterans who were more likely to be attacked for their service than honoured for it. Frequently, the only provocation for a beating, shooting or whipping was the wearing of a service uniform in public. In the United States, such symbolic displays of black manhood could not be countenanced. In the First World War, if the First World War opened the door to black advancement, then in 1919 the door was slammed shut again. Throughout the nation, the 1920s witnessed the consolidation of white political and economic power. In the South, NAACP membership smashed by white violence. Mid-1920s, there remained only a few branches of the association, none of which were to be found outside of the large cities. The beating of John Shillady was an object lesson in racial domination. Shillady was a white guy from New York who was secretary of the NAACP, and he travelled to Austin, Texas, in order to talk to state officials about the NAACP, and he was beaten senseless outside of his home, outside of his hotel by three men, one of whom was a county judge. Many northern whites were no less hostile to black advancement. July 1919, a race riot in Chicago claimed 38 lives, in the process destroying any hope for racial integration. From this point onwards, although the Supreme Court had ruled against the creation of racial zones, the ghettoisation of blacks began in earnest as private landlords signed restrictive covenants prohibiting the sale or letting of property to African Americans. This ghettoisation led to the de facto segregation of education, a problem that persists today and which Obama tried and failed to remedy. What could African Americans do in the face of this wave of violence and ghettoisation? Some counselled resistance. As Claude McKay declared in his poem, If We Must Die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honour us through dead, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. As most knew, however, the use of force was self-defeating. The police, courts, prisons were all in white hands. The door to black advancement would open again almost 40 years later in 1955, when Rosa Parks, only a year old when the war began, refused to give up her bus seat to a white woman in Montgomery, Alabama, sparking an African-American boycott of the city's buses and bringing a local pastor, Martin Luther King Jr., to national prominence. But that is another story. Goodness, well, I learned an awful lot from that. I don't know about you. Yeah, please don't ask me any questions about it. That is the sum total of my knowledge about this particular topic. I don't know if anyone has any observations. Go on, yes.
Didn't we hear earlier that German American, Italian American became banned before the war, and yet we commonly use African American?
Mm-hmm.
It just seems wrong in some way. You know,
Right.
if you're not allowed to be, it's distinguishing African American. Because all the others are white, aren't they?
You mean that designation is compelling segregation?
Yeah. People should be people.
Well,
Yeah.
Make a response. I mean, we use lots of terminology. For example, Korean American, Chinese American, Japanese American. So I think
They're
this
still
is
doing
only
it.
division. So you kind of say because of we should try to be equal. So we can assign the terminology to those people who are obviously different from European Americans.
Okay.
Kendra, would you mind if I just put you on the spot a little bit?
Yeah.
How much of what you were hearing there echoes one of your main areas of expertise, the Vietnam War? Are there very clear parallels there, or is that overstating it? And just in terms of our big question today about continuity and connecting the First World War to what happens next, is there parallels?
In particular, what you were talking about returning black veteran, where just the assumption that seems to take place is that, I mean, in the wake of the Vietnam War, there was a concern about the violent young men who had been trained in the sort of instruments of arms coming home and releasing that sort of violence upon the domestic front. Now, you do see that being a concern with white veterans. You see a series of sort of movies over the course of the 1970s that have the kind of psychotic veteran, movies like Taxi Driver and so on. But it's a real concern with respect to African Americans for exactly the same reasons that seem to be, and for none of the same, without any justification really. It's, there is a kind of radicalization of black politics, just as there was in the First World War, and there is a language about, the need for African Americans to resist white violence with their own violence, and that gets pinned to the idea that African American veterans are going to be peculiarly skilled as a result of their service in the war to come back and sort of fight those battles. It doesn't really happen like that at all, but it's that sort of lingering concern that you see you see expressed then by sort of white media outlets and white Ku Klux Klan and whatever, that seems to be a recurrent feature.
Is that language by white commentators, is it couched, do they pull their punches compared to the very, very blunt language that we heard in 1917?
Oh, it's more coded.
the alleged rape of white women by black soldiers in the First World War. There's a perfect illustration of that continuing in the Second World War. There's a little town in Somerset called Shepton Mallet. And Shepton Mallet was one of 3 or 4 American court-martials that they've sent as court-martials, Americans, in the Second World War. One black soldier was court-martialed and executed. And why? He had fallen in love with the wife of an English captain in the army. And the English captain said to his wife, now, if you don't say that this American soldier has raped you, you will lose all your inheritance, I will give you nothing. She testified against this black person. He was executed at Shepton Mallet. I think it was in 1942.
I do know that the presence of, I mean, this is moving it forward, that the presence of black figures in Britain during the Second World War in Britain is a troubling issue for the British government, because the British government has obviously always espoused the absence of a colour bar within the empire, but then is faced with difficulties of informal racist attitudes amongst British home populations when, for example, the famous cricketer Leary Constantine comes and, and is barred from entry to particular hotels in central London. There's a big political hoo-ha about that. So there's a kind of in Britain, it's where there's a point at which your rhetoric, we're talking about the distinction between rhetoric and reality, the point at which your rhetoric and your everyone espousing liberal beliefs in theoretical equality hits up against the blunt realities of discrimination. It's an interesting case study.
Yeah, but if you're looking for parallels, you don't need to go 20 years or 50 years into the future. Just look at the attitudes of the imperial powers in Britain during the First World War, and you'll see everything you've said reflected in a much milder form. But whether it's Indian troops being billeted in Brighton, or whether it's Chinese workers being given the worst possible tasks on the front, or the imperial troops being sent into the most difficult fighting situations, say it's all there in another form.
I agree entirely, and there's very clear echoes there with what coloured seamen are undertaking in ports of Britain during the 1920s as well, kind of being drawn towards more radical politics. Great, thank you very much. That was I found that really interesting. I can say that completely without being fake modest about it, because I had no part of this. Let us have a 15-minute break and we will reconvene for our final session.